January 12, 1945. Somewhere in the South China Sea, a Japanese destroyer captain radioed his last message before vanishing from the surface of the ocean. 10 ships in his convoy, gone. 7 warships, obliterated. 46 vessels in total, sent to the bottom in a single day. The weapon? Not a fleet, not an armada, just one small carrier task force that wasn't supposed to be there. A force the Japanese High Command believed was trapped hundreds of miles away in the Philippines. A force that had slipped through their defenses like a ghost, penetrated the most protected waters in the Japanese Empire, and unleashed a storm of steel and fire so devastating that Tokyo initially refused to believe the reports. When the truth finally reached Imperial headquarters, senior commanders stood in stunned silence. How had an American carrier force crossed an entire sea undetected? How had they destroyed Japan's most vital supply convoys in broad daylight? And how, after laying waste to everything in sight, had they simply disappeared back into the Pacific? This is the story of Operation Gratitude, the 10-day raid that shattered Japan's confidence, severed their oil lifeline, and proved that no corner of their empire was safe anymore. This is the story of how a small task force changed the course of the Pacific War and left Japanese admirals asking a question they could never answer. How did we not see them coming? For 3 years, the South China Sea had been Japan's highway. Since the lightning campaigns of 1941 and 1942, these waters carried the lifeblood of the empire. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, bauxite from Borneo. Every tanker that sailed north meant another month of resistance. Every convoy that reached the home islands kept the war machine grinding forward. Tokyo knew the arithmetic of survival. Without these supply routes, Japan would starve. Without oil, the fleet would rust at anchor. The South China Sea wasn't just strategic territory, it was oxygen. But by late 1944, that oxygen was running thin. American submarines prowled the depths like wolves, sending tanker after tanker to the seafloor. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October had gutted the Imperial Japanese Navy. 4 carriers lost, 3 battleships sunk, 10 cruisers destroyed. What remained of Japan's once mighty fleet limped back to home waters, fuel tanks nearly empty, crews demoralized. The Philippine Islands, held since 1942, were slipping from Tokyo's grasp. General MacArthur had returned to Leyte in October. By December, American forces were pushing toward Mindoro, positioning themselves for the final leap to Luzon and Manila. Japan was bleeding. The question wasn't whether they would lose, it was how long they could hold on. And that answer depended entirely on the tankers still sailing through the South China Sea. Imperial headquarters ordered convoys to move faster, travel at night, hug the coastlines. They stationed destroyer escorts at key ports: Saigon, Cam Ranh Bay, Hong Kong. They positioned what remained of their naval strength to protect the shipping lanes. The logic was simple. If the Americans wanted to strangle Japan's supply routes, they would have to come through defended waters with submarines or long-range bombers flying from distant bases. Carrier task forces? Impossible. Too risky. Too far from American bases. The nearest carriers were operating near the Philippines, supporting MacArthur's invasion at Lingayen Gulf. Japanese convoy commanders sailed with cautious confidence. Yes, submarines were a threat. Yes, air raids from the Philippines might increase. But a massive carrier strike deep in the South China Sea, that belonged to the realm of fantasy. The Imperial Navy still controlled these waters. Their intelligence networks tracked American fleet movements. Their reconnaissance aircraft patrolled the sea lanes. If a carrier force tried to penetrate the South China Sea, they would see it coming. They would have time to react, to disperse, to prepare defenses. That's what the report said. That's what headquarters believed. That's what every destroyer captain told himself as he escorted another convoy through the darkness, watching the horizon, listening to the radio, waiting for warnings that would never come. Admiral William "Bull" Halsey wasn't a man who waited for permission. commander of the U.S. Third Fleet. He had spent 1944 hammering Japanese positions from the Marianas to the Philippines. By December, while MacArthur's forces secured Leyte and prepared for Lingayen Gulf, Halsey was already thinking bigger. The South China Sea, Japan's umbilical cord. If he could cut it, not with submarines alone, but with overwhelming air power, he could accelerate the empire's collapse. It was audacious. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of operation Halsey lived for. On December 26, 1944, the Japanese gave him another reason. A naval force, cruiser Ashigara, light cruiser Oyodo, and 6 destroyers, sortied from Cam Ranh Bay and raided American positions at Mindoro. They shelled the airfield, sank 2 LSTs loaded with supplies, and escaped before dawn. One destroyer, Kiyoshimo, didn't make it, torpedoed and sunk by American destroyers during the retreat. But the message was clear. Japan still had teeth, and they were willing to use them. Halsey saw opportunity. If Japanese warships were operating from Cam Ranh Bay, maybe larger prizes were there too. American intelligence reported sightings of the ice-class battleships, hybrid battleship carriers with flight decks aft, possibly anchored in Indo-Chinese ports. These weren't just targets, they were symbols. If Halsey could catch them at anchor and destroy them, it would be a propaganda coup and a strategic knockout. On December 28th, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, gave approval. Operation Gratitude was greenlit. Task Force 38 assembled at Ulithi Atoll. 3 fast carrier task groups, TG 38.1, 38.2, and 38.3, plus TG 38.5, the night carrier group. 11 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, 8 fast battleships, 15 cruisers, 50 destroyers, nearly 900 aircraft. It wasn't a small force by any measure, but compared to the sprawling armadas that had fought at Philippine Sea or Leyte Gulf, it was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. And it was about to sail into waters the Imperial Japanese Navy considered their own. The Japanese didn't see it coming because they couldn't imagine it. Their reconnaissance network was stretched thin. Pilots were inexperienced. Radar technology lagged behind American advancements. Inter-service rivalry between the Army and Navy meant poor communication and duplicated efforts. Convoy escorts were undermanned. Most destroyers had been sunk at Leyte Gulf or were guarding the home islands. What remained were older vessels, coast defense ships, and patrol boats crewed by sailors who had never faced concentrated carrier air power. They had been told the Americans were occupied in the Philippines. They had been told the South China Sea was too far, too risky for a deep penetration raid. They had been told they were safe. Every single assumption was about to be shattered in the most violent way imaginable. The night of January 9th, 1945. Task Force 38 slipped through the Bashi Channel between Formosa and Luzon like a shadow passing under a door. No lights. Radio silence. Destroyers on the flanks scanned for Japanese picket boats. Radar operators watched their screens for contacts that never appeared. The sea was dark. The sky was darker. 17 capital ships, dozens of escorts, and nearly 1,000 aircraft moved through waters Japan had controlled for 3 years, and no one saw them. January 10th. The fleet cleared the channel and turned southwest into the South China Sea. Lookouts scanned the horizon. Nothing. The carriers maintained course and speed, their hulls cutting through calm water. By nightfall, they were 200 miles inside enemy territory. Still no contact, no alarms, no patrol planes. Japan's eyes were closed. January 11th. Heavy weather rolled in. The fleet refueled at sea, a dangerous ballet of tankers and warships connected by hoses in rising swells. Destroyers peeled off to screen the formation. Carrier decks pitched and heaved. The mission was still secret. The Japanese still had no idea. Task Force 38 regrouped and turned west, heading for the coast of French Indochina. The commanders reviewed intelligence reports. Convoys were moving along the coastline. Saigon harbor was full of shipping. Cam Ranh Bay might hold the ice-class battleships. Halsey's orders were simple. Find everything. Sink everything. Pre-dawn, January 12th. The night carrier USS Independence launched its reconnaissance aircraft into the darkness. Pilots flew low over black water, watching the coastline materialize in the faint pre-dawn glow. 30 miles off Quinnon, Cam Ranh Bay, Cape Padaran, Cape St. Jacques, Saigon River approaches. Their cameras clicked. Their radios crackled back to the fleet. Targets everywhere. Convoys, tankers, destroyer escorts, anchored transports. Dozens of vessels clustered along the coast like sheep in a pen. The pilots couldn't believe what they were seeing. It was a shooting gallery. 7:31 a.m. The first strike launched. Hellcats, Avengers, Helldivers. Wave after wave roaring off the carrier decks, forming up in the morning sky, turning toward the Vietnamese coast. The Japanese convoy near Quinnon never had a chance. 10 ships, 7 warships of the 101st Flotilla providing escort. They were sailing slowly, fuel-heavy, confident. Then the sky opened up. Dive bombers screaming down. Torpedoes cutting white trails through the water. Machine gun fire raking decks. The light cruiser Kashi erupted in flames, her magazines detonating, her hull breaking apart. 4 oil tankers, precious, irreplaceable oil tankers, took torpedoes amidships and sank within minutes. 3 freighters loaded with supplies rolled over and disappeared. Destroyer escorts fired back desperately, their anti-aircraft guns chattering, but there were too many aircraft, coming from too many directions. Within an hour, the convoy ceased to exist. 30 miles south, the convoy near Cape Padaran heard the radio calls. Panic, screaming, then silence. They didn't have time to process it. The second wave arrived. A tanker exploded. 2 destroyer escorts fought back, but one took a bomb through the deck and sank in 4 minutes. A patrol boat tried to run and was strafed until it caught fire and drifted. The water burned with leaking fuel. Survivors clung to debris, watching American aircraft circle overhead like hawks. Cape St. Jacques, the approaches to Saigon. The third convoy was larger. 2 freighters, 3 tankers, 3 destroyer escorts, and a landing craft moving in loose formation. They had received fragmentary radio reports from the north. Garbled transmissions, explosions, then nothing. The convoy commander ordered increased speed and tighter formation. His radar was primitive. His air cover was non-existent. When the American aircraft appeared on the horizon, he knew immediately it was over. The attack was methodical. Helldivers targeted the tankers first. Fuel was the priority. The first tanker took 3 bombs and exploded with such force that the shockwave capsized the landing craft 100 yards away. The second tanker burned, her crew abandoning ship as flames spread across the water. The third tried evasive maneuvers but took 2 torpedoes and settled by the stern, sinking slowly. The freighters were next. One broke in half, the other listed and capsized. The destroyer escorts fired every gun they had, filling the sky with black puffs of flak. But the Americans had learned their tactics well. Come in low, spread out, hit from multiple angles. One escort took a direct hit to the bridge and went dead in the water. Another was strafed so heavily, her superstructure looked like Swiss cheese. By noon, 7 more ships had joined the wreckage on the seafloor. Saigon harbor itself became a killing zone. Tankers at anchor, freighters being loaded, coastal vessels clustered near the docks. American aircraft swept in low over the city, ignoring anti-aircraft fire from shore batteries, focusing on the ships. Bombs fell in tight patterns. Torpedoes ran straight and true. One tanker exploded with such intensity that windows shattered across the waterfront. Another settled into the mud, blocking a pier. A third burned for hours, thick black smoke rising into the afternoon sky. Dock workers fled. Crew members jumped into the water. The harbourmaster's office watched helplessly as months of logistics planning disintegrated in minutes. Halsey had sent a surface strike group, battleships Iowa and New Jersey, 3 cruisers and 8 destroyers, racing ahead to engage any major warships at Cam Ranh Bay. They steamed at 25 knots, guns loaded, crews at battle stations. The intelligence had been wrong. The Ice-class battleships weren't there. The harbor was empty except for a few small vessels. The surface group found nothing worth their ammunition. But it didn't matter. The carriers had done the real work. By sunset on January 12th, the tally was staggering. 46 ships sunk, 13 warships destroyed. The light cruiser Kashi, multiple destroyers, destroyer escorts, patrol boats, coast defense vessels. 33 merchant vessels totaling 285 tons sent to the bottom. 12 oil tankers, each one a critical artery severed. American losses? 23 aircraft, most of those to accidents or mechanical failure, not enemy action. The Japanese had been overwhelmed, outmatched, obliterated. In Tokyo, the reports arrived in fragments. Radio operators pieced together desperate transmissions. Naval intelligence tried to make sense of the scale. Where had the Americans come from? How had they achieved complete surprise? Senior commanders refused to believe the numbers at first. 46 ships in one day? Impossible. But the convoy manifests didn't lie. The radio silence from destroyed escorts didn't lie. By the evening of January 13th, Imperial headquarters understood the truth. An American carrier force had penetrated their most secure waters, destroyed their most vital convoys, and vanished back into the Pacific. And they hadn't been able to stop it. January 13th. Task Force 38 didn't celebrate. They refueled at sea, racing ahead of a typhoon building in the South China Sea. The weather turned hostile. Heavy swells, low visibility, rain squalls sweeping across the flight decks. Destroyers rolled in the waves. Tanker hoses snapped and had to be reconnected. But the fleet pressed on. Halsey wasn't finished. The South China Sea had been the first blow. Now he would hit Formosa on the way out. January 15th. The weather was still miserable. Low clouds, poor visibility, winds gusting across the carriers. But the strikes launched anyway. Formosa, the island fortress Japan had held since 1895. American aircraft broke through the clouds over Takao City on the southwestern coast. The harbor was full of shipping, coastal vessels, transports, and one destroyer, Hatakazi, anchored near the docks. The Helldivers found her immediately. Bombs fell in a tight pattern. 2 direct hits, one near miss that buckled her hull plates. Hatakazi listed, took on water, and sank at her moorings. Her crew abandoned ship, swimming through debris and oil slicks. Another destroyer gone. 50 miles away, in the Pescadores Islands, the destroyer Tsuga was attempting to hide in a small anchorage. She had received warnings. She knew American carriers were operating nearby. Her captain had ordered camouflage netting rigged and gun crews on constant alert. It didn't matter. A flight of Avengers spotted her from altitude, dove through the clouds, and launched torpedoes. Tsuga maneuvered desperately, but the shallow anchorage gave her no room. 2 torpedoes struck amidships. Her engine room flooded. Her bow lifted as the stern sank. Within 8 minutes, she disappeared beneath the surface. 2 more destroyers in 2 different locations, both caught, both destroyed. January 16th, Hong Kong. One of the busiest ports remaining under Japanese control. A major logistics hub. Warehouses full of supplies, docks crowded with shipping. And critically, 5 large oil tankers from convoy High 87, originally bound for Japan, diverted to Hong Kong after intelligence warnings about American submarines. The convoy had escaped one threat. They sailed straight into another. The strikes began at dawn. 296 aircraft sorties over Hong Kong harbor. The Japanese were ready this time. Anti-aircraft batteries lined the hills. Fighter aircraft scrambled from nearby airfields. The sky filled with flak and tracer fire. American pilots pushed through, taking losses, staying focused on the tankers. The first tanker took 3 bomb hits and exploded, her cargo of aviation fuel turning the water into an inferno. The second was torpedoed and broke in half. The third caught fire and burned for hours. The fourth and fifth were bombed until they sank at the piers, blocking harbor access. 5 irreplaceable tankers, gone. But the cost was higher this time. Japanese fighters pressed their attacks. Anti-aircraft fire was accurate and heavy. 22 American aircraft were shot down in combat. 27 more were lost to operational accidents. Damaged planes ditching at sea, crashes on carrier decks in bad weather, engines failing during recovery. The fleet had been deep in enemy waters for 7 days. They had struck 4 separate target areas. They had sunk destroyers, tankers, freighters, and everything in between. But now fuel was running low. Ammunition stocks were depleted. Aircraft needed maintenance, and Japanese patrol planes were finally finding them. Tokyo radio broadcast confidently on January 18th. The American fleet had been bottled up in the South China Sea. Japanese forces were closing in. The enemy would be trapped and destroyed. It was pure propaganda, designed to save face, to reassure a nervous public. But the reality was the opposite. Task Force 38 was already moving north, heading for the exit, and the Japanese had no way to stop them. January 20th. The fleet approached Balintang Channel between Formosa and the Bataan Islands, a different exit route than they had used to enter. Japanese reconnaissance finally spotted them. Patrol planes shadowed the formation, radioing positions, coordinating what they hoped would be a final strike. 15 aircraft, evacuation planes hastily armed with bombs, launched a desperate attack. American fighters intercepted them before they reached the carriers. All 15 were shot down. Not a single bomb fell on a U.S. ship. The fleet steamed through the channel unopposed, leaving the South China Sea behind, returning to the open Pacific, where they belonged. January 25th. Task Force 38 anchored at Ulithi Atoll. The crews were exhausted. The ships needed replenishment, but the mission had been an undeniable success. 3,800 miles sailed, 10 days of operations deep in enemy-controlled waters. 13 warships destroyed, cruisers, destroyers, escorts, patrol boats. 25 oil tankers sunk. The lifeblood of Japan's war machine spilled across the seafloor. Dozens of freighters, transports, and coastal vessels obliterated. Total merchant tonnage lost, over 300,000 tons. Admiral Nimitz reviewed the after-action reports and sent a message to Halsey. The operation was well conceived and brilliantly executed, but the real impact wasn't measured in ships alone. It was measured in what happened next. Japanese Imperial headquarters panicked. If American carriers could penetrate the South China Sea at will, nowhere was safe. They diverted 5 full infantry divisions, troops desperately needed elsewhere, to defend the coasts of southern China and Indochina. Resources that could have reinforced Iwo Jima or Okinawa were instead scattered across thousands of miles of coastline, waiting for an invasion that never came. On March 9, 1945, Japan moved to take direct control of French Indochina, overthrowing the Vichy French administration that had collaborated with them since 1940. Historians debate the reasons, but the South China Sea raid was a factor. Tokyo could no longer trust intermediaries. They needed absolute control of the ports, the airfields, the infrastructure. The raid had exposed how vulnerable their supply network was. They tightened their grip, but it was too late. By April 1945, Japan stopped sending convoys through the South China Sea entirely. The risk was too great. American submarines ruled the depths. American carriers could appear anywhere, anytime. The shipping lanes that had sustained the empire for 3 years went silent. Oil stopped flowing north. Rubber stayed in Malaya. Rice rotted in Indochinese warehouses. The strangulation was complete. One small carrier task force, operating for just 10 days, had severed an artery that would never heal. The South China Sea raid proved something the Japanese had refused to believe. The age of the battleship was over. Carriers were no longer support vessels. They were the fleet. A single task force, called small only because it wasn't the entire Pacific Armada, had sailed 3,000 miles, destroyed dozens of ships, killed thousands of sailors, and escaped without losing a single capital vessel. It was power projection on a scale the world had never seen. Mobility, air power, and coordination had replaced armor and guns as the definition of naval dominance. Japan's admirals understood, too late, what they were facing. They had built an empire on the assumption that they could defend critical waters with surface fleets and land-based aircraft. The South China Sea was supposed to be safe, too far from American bases, too well patrolled, too heavily defended. But none of it mattered. The carriers came anyway. They struck with surgical precision. They vanished before reinforcements arrived. There was no counter, no strategy, no hope. The oil tankers were what mattered most. Steel could be recycled. Ships could be rebuilt. But oil, Japan had almost none. Every tanker sunk was a month of fuel gone forever. By April 1945, the Imperial Navy had fuel for one more major operation. They chose Okinawa, Operation Tengo, the battleship Yamato's suicide run. She was sunk before reaching the target. After that, the fleet stayed in port, not because they lacked will, because they lacked fuel. The South China Sea raid had sentenced them to paralysis. Admiral Nimitz's praise, well conceived and brilliantly executed, was more than a compliment. It was recognition of a turning point. In December 1941, American carriers had been scattered, desperate, outmatched. By January 1945, they roamed the Pacific like apex predators. They chose when to strike. They chose where to strike. The Japanese could only react, and even that was often too late. The South China Sea had been Japan's highway, their supply route, their lifeline. Operation Gratitude turned it into a graveyard. The wrecks of destroyers and tankers lay scattered across the seafloor, silent monuments to a doomed empire. And the commanders, who had sailed those waters with confidence for 3 years, could only ask themselves one question. Over and over until the end, how did we not see them coming?